Which GED math topics do you need to know to pass GED math? Well, in this video I'm going to give you a big list of GED math topics to help you pass GED math as fast as possible. Hi, this is Parker from Test Prep Champions, teaching you how to pass the GED fast, and you can get started by clicking subscribe down below. So, I want to give a shout out to Teresa for giving me the idea for this video, and I'm really excited to share this video with you because I think that this is really going to help you gain clarity on exactly what you need to know to pass GED math. So just a few notes though before we get started, and these notes are very important. So first of all, be aware that this list includes the majority of the topics that you need to know for GED math. Now, the main exception is geometry. So I didn't include any GED geometry here on this list because I don't want you to get too bogged down because the list is quite extensive, and also because geometry deserves its own video. So I'm going to be doing a separate video shortly that gives you a list of geometry topics to know. Alright, so besides geometry though, this list does include the majority of the topics that you have to know, and there's more than enough to pass right here in this video. Also, note that nobody can predict exactly which questions you're going to get. Now, there are certain math topics that tend to show up more often than others on the GED math test, and this comes from my experience working with students both in person and talking to test takers on YouTube here and through email. So I'm going to be emphasizing the topics that are most likely to show up on the GED math test. But that being said, nobody can predict exactly which questions you're going to get. So there's no guarantee of what's going to show up and what's not going to show up. All right, so it's all fair game. Anything that I show you on this list here could potentially show up. So also note that I don't want you to get overwhelmed because there are quite a few things that are going to be on this list. So know that you don't have to know every single thing on this list to pass. But that being said, it is all fair game. So if you choose to skip over some topics on this list, just know that there's the possibility that they could come back to haunt you on the GED test if you get questions on those topics. All right, so don't stress over every single little thing on this list. All right, you don't have to know it all to pass, but at the same time, it's all fair game. So the more that you learn, the better off you're going to be. But if you don't have time to learn every single little thing, as long as you know enough to pass, you should still be okay. All right, so I recommend that you take notes here, make yourself a checklist of the topics here, and cross off topics once you feel like you've mastered them. So I'm also expecting that you'll pause the video whenever you need to. Also note that you can rewind or watch the video multiple times as we go along here, because as I'm talking here, I'm going to be talking at a moderate pace, and it might be hard to take notes while I'm talking here. So you can pause the video, rewind, or watch multiple times as you need to. So we're going to start our list with some GED math basic skills, and one of these is identifying place values. So if you look at an example, 32,489, you should be able to know which number is in the ones place, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, and the 10,000s. You should also be able to identify the 100,000s place and the millions place. So you also want to know how to compare and order numbers for the test. So for example, you may be given some numbers and you might be asked to put them in order from least to greatest or from greatest to least. Rounding is also a very important basic skill to have mastered for the GED test. So many questions may ask you to round your answer to the nearest 100 or to the nearest 1,000 or to the nearest 10, and you'll have to know what that means. So moving on here with some more basic math skills. So you want to be able to add and to do addition both with the calculator, which is as simple as pressing some buttons, and also you want to be able to do some addition by hand. So you have to understand that you add to combine numbers, and during addition, when the digits in a place value add up to 10 or more, you're going to have to regroup to the next place value. So you want to know about regrouping. So in addition to addition, pun intended, you need to be able to do subtraction both with a calculator, which is very simple, and also by hand, and you'll have to know how to do borrowing. So also multiplication and division are also important to know how to do both with your calculator and by hand. Now, for the majority of your test, you are going to have a calculator, so I wouldn't put too much time into learning to add, subtract, multiply, and divide by hand or just with scratch paper. So you'll want to practice it a little bit, but don't stress it because you'll have that calculator for most of the test. So for division, here are some terms you'll want to know. So the dividend, so the number that's being divided is the dividend. And what is addition? Well, or I'm sorry, what is division, I mean? Division is dividing a number up into as many equal parts as possible. So again, the number being divided is your dividend. The number that you're dividing by is what we call the divisor, and the answer that you get is called the quotient. So here's a quick tip here. Your life is going to be a lot easier if you memorize your basic multiplication and division tables, and I would recommend that you learn your timetables from at least 1 to 10, but I would go up to 12 if you can. So I'll put a link down below to websites and to YouTube videos where in a relatively short period of time you can learn your multiplication and division tables. Now, the basic addition and subtraction is important, but you can always do that by hand or in your head, but I think that knowing your multiplication and division tables is really going to be important for the GED test when you can't use your calculator. So another important thing is word problems, and so word problems can cause a lot of people anxiety. So I do have a 5-step process, and you just have to remember the word FIOS, F-I-O-S, or really I should say double S, and this is an approach that I teach to word problems. It's a 5-step process. So the F in FIOS stands for find. So whenever you're solving a word problem, you want to ask yourself, what is the question asking me to find? The I stands for info. So you want to look at the information that you're given in the word problem, and you want to look at the information that you'll need. So sometimes you'll be given more information than you'll need. You won't always need to use all of the info provided. So you want to draw a distinction between the info that you're given and the info that you need to solve the question. So the O stands for operation. Which operation or operations do you need to use? So by operation, what I mean is addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Sometimes you'll, in fact, in many cases, you'll be using more than one operation, and you also may need to write an equation. In fact, for many word problems, you will have to write equations based off of words. So the last step is to solve the question. Solve the question and ask, does your answer make sense? And that's really important. So always look and make sure your answer makes sense. And the simple way to do that is just look back at the first step. What did you have to find? So ask, does my answer make sense? Did I find what I was originally trying to find? So this is just a basic framework to help you with word problems on the GED test. And so in addition to word problems, you'll want to know how to use the distance and cost formulas. So some basic types of word problems may ask you to use the distance formula or the cost formula. And distance formula questions and cost formula questions are actually fairly common on the GED test. So the cost formula is total cost equals the number of units times price per unit. And the distance formula is distance is equal to rate times time. So typically you'll be given values, and you're going to be given 2 of these values, right? And you'll be asked to solve for an unknown variable. So for example, they may give you a question where they tell you the distance and they give you the time and they ask you to find the rate. So they might say, you know, Sally, for example, Sally drove 100 miles and this is how long it took her. She drove 100 miles. It took her an hour or it took her 2 hours. What was her rate or what was her speed? Something like that. So they'll give you two numbers in the formula and you'll have to find the third. So if they give you the distance and the time, you'll have to rearrange the distance formula to solve for the rate. All right, so that's a common example. Same with the cost. So you'll want to get some practice with the distance formula and cost formulas, but these questions are fairly straightforward, hopefully. So another skill that you'll want to master for the GED test is how to work with fractions. And so fractions can cause people a lot of stress and anxiety, but I think that really the basics are the most important thing to know about for fractions. And so for a lot of the tests, you'll have that calculator. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, different operations with fractions are fairly straightforward if you know how to use them in your calculator. But there's some basic things about fractions that you also want to know other than how to use them to solve problems. So you'll want to know that a fraction, it uses 2 numbers to represent a whole. So in any fraction, the top number is called the numerator, and the numerator tells you how many parts you're working with. Now the bottom number in a fraction is called the denominator, and it tells you how many equal parts make up that whole. Now you'll also want to know the difference between proper fractions, improper fractions, and mixed numbers. A proper fraction is a number that is less than 1. And so a proper fraction, the top number is always going to be a smaller number than the bottom number. Okay, so for an improper fraction, it's the other way around. If for an improper fraction, the top number is greater than the bottom number, all right, and the value is going to be greater than 1. And for a mixed number, the number is also going to be greater than 1, because improper fractions and mixed numbers, all right, they're really just two different ways of writing the same thing. So you'll want to know how to convert between improper fractions and mixed numbers and vice versa. And I've got other videos on doing that. So I'm going to link down below to my GED math playlist where I cover most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this video. You'll also want to, when it comes to fractions, you'll have to know how to lower fractions. Some people call that simplifying. So you want to know how to lower or simplify fractions. You also need to know how to raise fractions. And so again, with the calculator, you'll be able to put answers into your put fractions into your calculator and simplify them in the calculator if you know how to do that. So that's usually not that hard. There are some tricks that are good to help you lower or simplify fractions. I have a whole other video on that as well. A skill that's not as important is raising fractions. You won't commonly have to raise fractions as much as you'll be asked to lower or simplify them, but you'll need to know how to raise fractions. But just keep in mind that that's not typically as important, but it's something you should know. All right. So another thing that's one of the most important things to know about fractions is how to do operations with them, how to add them, subtract them, multiply and divide with fractions. And like I said, for most of the tests, you'll be able to do this in your calculator, okay, but you should know what like fractions are. So in other words, fractions that have a common denominator are called like fractions. So for addition and subtraction, you'll always need to get a common denominator. For multiplication and division, you don't need that common denominator. All right, so here's another champion tip. Answer choices on your test are always going to be in simplest terms. So when you're looking at a multiple choice question, if it has to do with fractions and you get an answer, you do the math and you get a certain answer, but you look down below at the multiple choice answer choices and you don't see that fraction down there and you think, what did I do wrong? You might not have done anything wrong. You might just not have simplified your fraction. So always put your answers in simplest form, and when you look down at the answer choices, note that they are in simplest form. So if your answer doesn't match one of the answer choices, consider that your fraction might not yet be in simplest form. So either use your calculator or use one of the tricks from my simplifying fractions video to put your fraction into simplest form. Okay, so moving along here, so from fractions we want to now talk about decimals. And so a lot of students would rather work with decimals than fractions. I think fractions are actually easier than decimals myself once you get the hang of it, but anyway, a skill that is important for decimals is understanding decimal place values. So for example, you'll want to know what I mean when I say tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and 10,000ths place, right? So here we see 0.238, and so you'd want to know that the 2 is in the tenths place, 3 is in the hundredths place, and 8 is in the thousandth place. It's a bit of a tongue twister to say, but hopefully you get my point here. All right, so you want to be able to recognize decimal place values, and you also want to know how to round with decimals. So if you can round whole numbers, you can round decimals. The steps are the same. All right, it's just, you just want to practice a little bit because there's a few slight nuances, but it's basically the same process. And just like with whole numbers, you also want to know how to compare and order decimals. All right, and it's not really that much harder, but you'll want to practice with it. Decimal operations are also important, so knowing how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide with decimals is also very important. And again, these operations are very similar to those with whole numbers, but one of the differences, you'll need to be mindful of where you put the decimal point in your answer. So as always, practice makes perfect. And lastly, fraction and decimal equivalents. So any fraction, you can always turn it into a decimal. If you take the top number, press division in your calculator, and then put the bottom number in, hit your equal sign, you're going to be able to turn that fraction into a decimal. So there are some common fraction and decimal equivalents that would be good to memorize. For example, half or 1/2 is equal to 0.5. All right, and so there are some other ones like 1/4, 1/4, that's equal to 0.25. But you don't necessarily have to memorize too many of them because you can always use your calculator. But just note that fractions and decimals, you'll want to be aware of that they are equal. If you take a fraction, you can turn it into a decimal. So you want to know some common fraction and decimal equivalents. So another important skill is mastering number lines. So you'll get a variety of different number line questions. There's the potential to get several different variations on number lines showing up on your test, right? So you might get asked to solve problems using number lines for whole numbers, but more commonly for fractions or decimals. So a typical multiple choice question might show you a point on a number line that's not labeled, and then they're going to give you other points on the number line that are labeled. So you'll see some of the numbers that are around a point, and that point's not going to be labeled, and you may have to identify the value of that point. All right, that could be a multiple choice question. You might also be asked to put a dot on a line where a certain value should be. So just keep in mind that these are some types of number line questions that are fairly common, and with some practice, these are usually pretty straightforward. So negative numbers also are commonly asked questions on a number line. You might be given a negative number, or you might see, like usually here on this number line here, I have 0, 1, 2, 3, but you also want to keep in mind that going the other way, really going off screen here, but you would also see like a -1, -2, and so on and so forth. So also, you might be given a number line and you might be asked to do addition and subtraction questions, and also inequality questions commonly come up with number lines. So just some other types of questions to keep in mind here. So moving right along here with ratios, proportions, and rates, and these are also very important for the GED test. Now, what is a ratio? Well, ratios compare numbers, and you might see ratios written with the word to, so for example, 3 to 1, or you might see it written with a colon, like 3:1, and you would say this is 3 to 1, or you might just see it written as a fraction like 3 to 1. So there's a couple different ways that you might see ratios written on your test. So just keep in mind that they're different ways of saying the same thing. So you also want to keep in mind that proportions are commonly asked on the GED test. And a proportion, it's just two ratios that are equal to each other. Now, you may be asked to compare proportions in different formats like numbers or on a graph or a chart. So you might even get a question where you have one quantity represented on a bar graph and another quantity that's represented in another format like a table. So if you get a question like that, a good way to do this would be to translate the quantities into numbers and then just compare those numbers. All right. So a common type of proportions question might be something like this. They might say, hey, there's a jar of coins here, and the ratio of pennies to dimes is 5 to 1. If there are 20 pennies in the jar, how many dimes are there? So I'm not going to walk you through that example here, but just note that that's a common type of proportions question that comes up on the GED test. So if you have no idea how to solve a question like that, then at least you know now that you might have to do a little bit of work with proportions. So rates are also common on the test. So what is a rate? Well, for example, 55 miles per hour, that is a rate. And so rates come up fairly often on the GED test as well. But really a rate, what you're doing is you're taking a quantity and you're comparing that to 1. So 55 miles per 1 hour is an example of a rate. Now, percents are also very important, and percents might be one of the most important things to know on this list. I've heard from several students that they had a question on their test that had to do with percents. All right, so you'll want to know how to convert percents to fractions into decimals and how to use the percent formula, which I'm not going to show in this video, but you'll want to know how to solve basic questions with percents. You'll also want to know how to do percent of change, and just be aware what a percent is. So percent means per 100. So another type of question on the test would be simple interest questions. So the formula for simple interest is not one that you'll have to memorize. So this simple interest formula is going to be given to you on your formula sheet. However, let me explain it right now. The formula goes like this: interest equals principal times rate times time. So what is the principal? Well, the principal is the amount that you borrow or invest, however you want to say it. It's the amount that you invest or the amount that you borrow. Okay. So for the rate, you want to note that, or for the time, you want to always write the time in years. And so on the test, note that the time is going to be written in years and the rate is going to be written as a fraction of a year. So you're going to want to take that rate and you're going to want to write months as a fraction of a year. So for example, the rate could be, we have here 5 over 12, right? So 5 months over 12 for 12 months in a year. All right, so you always want to, when you're dealing with rates for simple interest questions, just keep in mind that you write the months as a fraction of a year. So like I said, if it's 7 months, it'd be 7 over 12 would be your fraction. All right, so just keep that in mind. Now, here's a champion tip that I need just as much as you guys do. All right, now explain why in just a second. So for simple interest questions, some simple interest problems might be something simple, like they'll give you that simple interest formula, and they'll give you the rate and the time, and they'll give you maybe the interest, and they'll say find the principal, or maybe they'll give you the interest, they'll give you the principal, they'll give you the time, and ask you to find the rate. So something like that. But they might also add another step. So some simple interest problems will require an extra step. Okay, so and that step might be to add the principal and the interest to find the amount paid back. All right, so remember, if you take a loan out, you're not just going to be paying back the interest, and you're not just going to be paying back, all right, that initial amount. You're going to be paying back the principal plus the interest. If you take a loan out, all right, you're not just going to be paying back the amount that you borrowed, okay? And you're not just going to be paying back the interest. You're paying back that amount that you borrowed, all right, plus that amount, plus the interest, all right? And so, for example here, the amount that you invest or the amount that you borrow, again, that's the principal. And you're not just paying back the principal, you're paying back the principal plus the interest. So if the problem asks you to find the simple interest, or if it asks you to find that principal, all right, and then it also tells you to find the amount paid back, just remember to do that, all right? So I learned this the hard way, or I should say I forgot it the hard way, because in one of my GED math videos, in fact, my GED math practice test video, okay, in question number 8, I had a simple interest question that I wrote and that I made up, and I forgot to add the interest and the principal, all right, and so one of my audience members caught that mistake here, all right, and so I forgot to do this on one of my own practice tests, so I'm just emphasizing this so you know that always keep in mind that you may need to add the interest to the principal, all right, to find the amount paid back if that's what you're asked to do. Now, another common question is the data analysis question, all right, or questions. You might get multiple data analysis questions. Now, if I had to pick one topic to recommend for everybody taking the GED test to know, all right, one topic that you're most likely to face at some time during your GED test taking, that topic would be mean, median, mode, and range. Now, it's worth knowing because there's the potential for this to come up on the math section, but also for science, and also I've even heard that some test takers have gotten mean, median, mode, and range questions on the social studies test. So it's worth knowing how to do this because it can show up on your math test, but not only on your math test, it can also show up on those other sections. All right, so learn mean, median, mode, and range. That's just non-negotiable. That's something that you have to learn because there's a high chance that you're going to run into that, if not on math, on one of those other sections. Okay. So also, data analysis questions might involve tables, pictographs, bar graphs, line graphs, circle graphs, line plots, and histograms. So you might be thinking, that's a lot of different types of questions, and the answer is yes, but these types of questions are fairly straightforward after you've gotten some practice. So let me give you a few tips for data analysis questions that involve any kind of graphs or charts, right? So first of all, look at the labels and the keys. So whenever you're given a chart or a graph or a table, just pause and read the labels and read any keys that they provide you. Make sure that you also look at the titles of the graphs, like if the graph is named something, okay? And also beware of information overload because sometimes they'll give you a chart and there'll just be way too much information on it and you don't always need all that information to solve the question. So some of the information might just be there to kind of really overload you with info, but you might not always need it all. Okay, so again, you're going to have to separate the info that you're given from the info that you actually need to answer the question in certain cases. Also, just use common sense and logic. Just think your way through it, all right? Usually these questions are fairly straightforward, although they may seem complex. Like it might ask, it might give you a graph or a chart. You just got to think, just read what they're asking you to find, look on the graph, and just use common sense. Don't overthink it. All right, and just remember your basic math skills because a lot of these questions with tables, bar graphs, circle graphs, whatever you want to call it, all right, they just require common sense and they require you to remember your basic math skills. And basic math skills are really the key to the GED test, honestly, because you're going to be given a lot of different types of questions, and some of them that seem complex really just require a few basic math skills to answer, okay, even though it might not always appear that way. So that's a general theme throughout the GED math test. And as always, practice. So moving along here, you might also get probability questions. And probabilities might be given to you as a ratio, as a fraction, as a decimal, or as a percent. Now, one of the most common types of probability questions to get on your test are the simple probabilities, right? So theoretical, sometimes called simple probability. All right, so the theoretical or simple probability is the number of favorable outcomes divided by the number of possible outcomes. So for example, you might get a question where there are, say, 100 marbles in a jar and 2 of them are red, and they might ask you something like this. They might say, what's the probability of drawing a red marble on your first try? And in a case like that, the number of favorable outcomes would be 2 because there are 2 red marbles, and the total number of outcomes would be that 100. Okay, so that's a simple probability, and that's probably the most important type of probability to know for your test. All right, although, like I said earlier, everything is fair game. Then there's also the experimental probability, and the experimental probability is based on what we actually observe in real life. So the theoretical probability tells us what we expect to happen, and experimental probability is what we actually observe. All right, and then there's also independent and dependent probability. So, like I said, the most important one to understand would be your theoretical or your simple probability, but you also want to understand a little bit about independent and dependent probability. So when the probability of one event doesn't affect the probability of another event, those events are called independent. However, when the probability of one event impacts the other, we say that the events are dependent. So another type of data analysis question could involve combinations or permutations. So combinations are for picking several items out of a larger group of items when the order doesn't matter. And a common type of combination question may ask you how many ways can you combine a set of things, all right? So in addition to combinations, you also want to know about permutations. So permutations are used to find the number of possible outcomes when order matters. So combinations, order doesn't matter, and remember that for permutations, the order does matter. So some basic algebra skills would be working with negative numbers, like multiplying negative numbers. So you should know that if you multiply 2 negative numbers together, you get a positive number, and also that if you multiply a negative and a positive number, you're going to get a negative number. All right, so that's basic, but it is important. And also you want to understand power rules. Some people call these exponent rules, and I just filmed a video on this recently. Now, you also want to know about your square roots, all right? So there are some common square roots that you're just going to have to memorize. So as a champion tip here, I definitely would recommend for you to memorize some common square roots to boost your score. So I'll put a link down below to an article on a website that you can read in a fairly short amount of time, make some flashcards, or just copy the list down. Or what I also do in my square roots video on my channel here, I gave a list of some of the common square roots, but you'll want to know some of the common square roots, all right, so that you can boost your score. You want to memorize these. So things like, for example, what's the square root of 4? You should know that that's 2. What's the square root of 16? Square root of 16 is 4. All right, what about 36? The square root of 36 is 6. All right, so I'm not going to go through them all right now. Another one would be the square root of 25, which is 5. Those are just some off the top of my head that I can think of. Another example could be, 81. The square root of 81 is 9. But you'll want to know these off the top of your head. I highly recommend that you do learn these square roots. It's not going to take you that much time, but if they come up on the test, you don't want to be left there not being prepared for these kinds of questions. So in addition to knowing how to use negative numbers, also power rules and your square root rules, another important topic would be absolute values. So for example, the absolute value tells you the distance of a number from 0. So these little bars here, okay, I think they look like bars around the -4. That is an absolute value question. So the absolute value of -4 is just +4, and that's because the absolute value tells you the distance of a number from 0. You'll also want to be familiar with how to use scientific notation. So these topics are all important, but another really, really important topic, and this is one that I definitely recommend you have to know. In fact, this is kind of non-negotiable. You have to understand this for a variety of different question types, and this is the order of operations rules. Some people call these PEMDAs, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, but basically these are the order of operations rules. So the order that you do your operations, your multiplication and division, addition, subtraction, which order should you do it in? And you want to always start with what's in the parentheses. That's what the P stands for, right? So some people remember this as please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Some people just call it PEMDAs. But anyway, you start with whatever's inside parentheses. It also could be absolute values or another grouping sign. And then you would move on to exponents and roots. Then you do your multiplication and division, and then lastly your addition and subtraction. Now, the order of addition and subtraction is not that important, okay? You could do subtraction first. It doesn't really matter that much, but you do have to make sure that you finish your multiplication and division before your addition and subtraction. And like other topics on this list, I do have a video on PEMDAS that you might want to check out because I explain the order of operations rules in that video. So also you want to know how to solve equations, and this is really important for the GED test as well. So this is a really basic example, and you're probably not going to see something this simple on the test. Chances are you're going to get something more complicated, but if I gave you a question like this, 2 plus 4x equals 18, would you know how to solve that? And if not, it's okay. You'll want to see my video on equations, or you'll want to practice in your prep books or other resources, okay? But knowing how to solve equations is really important. And you can expect to get questions with single-step and multi-step equations like this. And so to solve the equation, basically what that means is you want to isolate that variable. So this x right here, that's a variable, which is another word for an unknown. So you want to get that by itself on one side of the equation, and then we'll have said that you solve the equation. Okay. So another important algebra skill is to be able to translate words into algebraic expressions. So what if I gave you something like this? The product of 4 and a number. Well, the product of 4 and some number, but we don't know what that number is, so we would just write that as 4x. Okay, and the word product is a keyword that tells us to multiply. So like with all these topics here, my purpose here, I'm not going to teach you every single thing you need to know in this video. All right, this is just to give you a checklist here. All right, but make sure that you understand how to do this for the test, because this is a really important skill. So something else that's important to understand is the distributive property. So basically the distributive property tells you that if I have 4 and then that's multiplied by x plus y in parentheses here, okay? Distributing that 4, all right, based on the distributive property, we can do 4 times x and 4 times y. So this 4 parentheses x plus y is actually equal to 4 times x plus 4 times y. So that is because of the distributive property. So keep that in mind. That's a common question I get with GED test takers who don't understand the distributive property. They'll watch my videos and I'll show them an example of using the distributive property. They won't understand it. Okay, some of them do actually. I should say most people do, but I've had some commenters ask questions about using this property. So here it is. This is the basic rule. Just make sure that you're familiar with it, because that's a common source of confusion for some students, certainly not for all of them. Okay, so you also want to be familiar with inequalities, and here's another champion tip. So the main thing to remember for inequalities is that whenever you reverse you need to reverse that inequality symbol when you multiply or divide both sides of an inequality by a negative number. So that's a champion tip, and if you haven't studied inequalities much up to this point now, this tip might not really mean that much to you yet, but I can promise you once you start to practice inequalities, you'll be able to appreciate this tip, because this is really probably the main thing that you need to know about inequalities, in my humble opinion. So to keep moving here, you also want to know about quadratic equations, which those can be a little bit tricky because they can be time consuming. I shouldn't say tricky, I really should say time consuming, but you'll want to know the difference between a linear equation and a quadratic equation, or at least be able to recognize the difference. So earlier on, I had this slide up here where I showed this 2 plus 4x equals 18. So that's the type of equation that you can solve it for x fairly simply. All right, just by you could do this. You could subtract 2 from both sides and then divide by 4. You could get the x by itself doing that. All right, so for a quadratic equation, you can't do that. All right, you've got to use the solution to the quadratic equation, or you're going to have to factor. Okay, so that's how you solve a quadratic equation. And that can be a little bit more time consuming, but you'll need to know how to do it. So you also need to know how to understand the coordinate plane and how to find points on a line based on the coordinate plane. And that's a very important skill. And slope questions and slope of a line and equation of a line questions are really important. I've heard so many people say that they got questions that had to do with slope on their test. So you want to know how to do it. Like other topics on this list, I have a video about slope where I cover the basic stuff you need to know here, but make sure that you know at least a little bit about slope and equations. And when I say equations, I mean know how to find the slope and know how to find the equation of a line, because those questions, all right, there's no guarantee if they'll come up or not, but they have a high chance of coming up. And you also want to know how to solve systems of linear equations and functions. So functions are another topic that comes up a lot on the GED test. All right, so you'll want to spend a little time studying functions. Now, you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of time studying them, but I've heard from many people that functions came up on their test. And so for functions, you want to know what is a function. Okay, what do I mean by a function? You want to know how to find the domain and the range of a function. That's fairly important. Finding the domain and range isn't that important, but it can come up on your test. It's fair game. So I wanted to mention it here, but you want to know the basic idea of a function, right? And you want to know how to solve function questions. And a typical example might be they'll give you like they'll write function notation, right? They'll write f of x, they'll write f parenthesis x, okay, and then they'll give you some kind of equation, and then instead of the x, they'll give you a 4, and you'll have to basically substitute 4 into the equation for x. And if you haven't studied functions yet, this might sound like I'm speaking a foreign language to you, so don't stress it. I don't want to cause you any more stress in this video over the math, but I just wanted to point out that that's a common type of functions question. So moving along here, more basic algebra skills would be factors and multiples. All right, so you should know what I mean by prime numbers, prime factorization, and greatest common factor questions, also known as GCF. Now, another topic that does come up a lot that for some reason a lot of students have trouble with, well, it can be a little bit tricky, but I think that polynomials are a topic that once you get them down, they kind of stick with you once you take the time to learn them. But basically, polynomial just means many numbers. Poly means many, nomial means number. So polynomial means many numbers, and polynomials can have different terms like coefficients, a variable, exponents, and constants. All right, so you'll want to know what polynomial terms are, and it's also good to know what I mean by a monomial, binomial, and trinomial. So a monomial is just a polynomial with only one term. A binomial is a polynomial with two terms, and a trinomial is a polynomial with three terms. All right, so those definitions, like you're probably not going to get a question that asks you about the definition of a monomial, right? But you're going to have to know how to solve problems with them. So one common type of question for polynomials would be how to simplify polynomials. So you'll want to know what I mean when I say like terms versus unlike terms. All right, so for polynomials, you'll combine the like terms, and the unlike terms, you can't combine them. And so also, you'll want to know how to do basic operations with polynomials like addition, subtraction, multiplication, but definitely division with polynomials, which a lot of students struggle with. But anyway, out of all these topics on this list now, what I want you to do is to pick 3 or 5 topics here, pick 3 to 5 topics, and make a commitment to study those. Once you've got those down, pick another 3 to 5 and keep doing this until you start feeling confident and until you're able to pass a GED ready practice test or get a likely to pass score. Then you're in good shape. And I want you to let me know down below. Please comment down below. Let me know which topics you're going to focus on from this list. And this is going to do 2 things. So number 1, it's going to let me know what you're working on so I know which kind of topics to focus my videos on. And number 2, you're going to be making a pledge here, right? You're making a pledge here publicly in YouTube in front of other people. I'm going to read your comment. Other people are going to see it. All right, so when you make a pledge that you're going to do something publicly, okay, you're more likely to follow through on it. So if you say down below, I'm going to study fractions and decimals and whatever it is that you're going to study, all right, by making that pledge, you're going to be making a pledge in front of a supportive community here that's test prep champions, and you're going to be more likely to follow through with it because you made that pledge to do it. And also it's going to let me know which comments, or it's going to let me know from reading the comments which topics you want me to focus on most in the other videos. So now that you've seen this video, your next step is to go quiz yourself on my GED math practice quiz. It's a short but sweet quiz, and it's going to help you learn what you need to know to pass GED math and help you figure out where you're at. So don't forget, though, to let me know down below which topics you're going to focus on and which topics you want to see me make videos on. Thank you for watching. This is Parker from Test Prep Champions. Click that subscribe button down below for that geometry video that's coming up, and thank you so much for watching.